Hi, visual communicators. Today I'm going to share with you how you use charts and graphs in your infographic. In creating your infographic, you are going to be journalists, and journalists and your infographic need to visualize some data or information. So today I'm going to focus on how you pick charts and graphs for your infographic and on different kinds of charts and graphs for your infographic. Now, this first slide is a very silly pie chart about Netflix. It's the most basic kind of pie chart. And what it shows is time spent looking for a movie versus time spent watching a movie. And I think that we can all probably relate to that. The purpose of a chart or a graph is to make data visual. You're taking numbers and you're putting them into a chart, and done well, these charts and graphs are intuitive for the viewer to process. One chart or graph does work that it would take many words to recreate. The key in picking a chart or a graph is picking the right one for the data you have, and to keep it focused, not to make it too complicated. And especially at this level in creating your first infographics, you want to make sure that you're doing something that's within your skill set, and to make sure that your math makes sense. The infographic that you create for this class must visualize some data or information. So in addition today to talking about different kinds of charts and graphs, I'm also going to talk about a couple of other ways to visualize information. The first way that you can visualize data is with charts. And I'm going to take you through three kinds of charts: line charts, bar charts, and pie charts. Line charts are the best way to show changes over time. We also call them fever charts. When you're creating a line chart, you put a timeline at the bottom. I'm going to give you an example in a second. And along the left side, the data whose change you're showing goes on the left axis. We've seen a million fever charts or line charts related to coronavirus, and here is just one of them. This chart shows the rate at which the coronavirus case total has shot up worldwide. We've got two aspects to this line. We have the numbers on the left in thousands, and along the bottom we have the dates, starting with December 31st and ending with March 30th. So we can see here cases are in yellow. Starting December 31st, we were at 0, and by March 30th, we were at around 700,000 cases. Deaths are in the green line. Here we start with 0 deaths at December 31st, and probably just 20,000 or so deaths in by March 30th. One thing to note about this chart is the role that color plays. Color is a very important aspect of creating charts and graphs. In this case, we see in the title that cases is yellow and that deaths are green, and the cases line is yellow and the death line is green. This helps the viewer visually connect what is being represented with the actual representation of that data. So one key thing to consider is, how do you use color to make your chart clearer? A bar chart is using bars or columns that can also show changes over time, but they are also more commonly used to compare quantities of one thing to another. Here we have a simple column chart. And by the way, column charts are vertical and bar charts are horizontal, but they can represent the exact same data. They're just oriented a different way. So here we have new coronavirus cases shown changing over time. This could have been done with a line chart, starting with a line here at 0, which was what was represented in the first chart, the line chart I showed you. So it starts at 0 and then it goes up over time. So this is a very simple column chart. It's just comparing one thing, which is the change of the cases over time. Here is what we refer to as a stacked column chart. It's a little bit more complicated. And the thing about stacked column charts is many of them that you will find online are too complex. You want to keep it, if you're going to use a stacked chart, you want to keep it simple. In this case, we're just comparing 3 things. But if you add more than 3 things, it gets more complicated for the viewer to process. Again, color is very important in this. So this is a chart comparing graduate enrollment and completion by race. Among white students, we can see that a little more than 20% have earned a degree. A little more than around 35% have no degree, but they're still enrolled in school. And then we've got around 38% who have no degree and they're no longer enrolled in school. We're comparing the exact same thing now, but with African Americans graduate students. We can see a slightly higher percentage of African Americans earned a degree than whites. That's in red. So here's the red, earned a degree, earned a degree. We can see that around 43% have no degree, but they're still enrolled. And then we can see that around 47% have no degree and they're no longer enrolled. So if you compare white to black, overall, you can see that more African American students are in school, have earned a degree, or are in school or have no degree. We can see that more African American students are enrolled in African American students are enrolled in grad programs than white students. If you wanted to make this a bar chart, you would simply turn this data on its side. So white and black would be here, and the percentages would be along the bottom. This vertical orientation, though, is a little bit easier to process. Here's an example of a student's infographic from last spring. He's taken data from the Kansas City Business Journal and the U.S. Department of Education website to show the percentage of graduates, not grad students, but graduates who graduate with debt by university. We can see that in Kansas State, 57% graduate with debt, and so forth. Baker University, interestingly, the students there graduate with more students there graduate with debt than at other schools, in this case 90%. Now, while these are not color-coded, using different colors helps to differentiate the bars more clearly than if these were all the same color. Visually, this is a trigger for the viewer that these are separate schools. And this, by the way, is a traditional bar chart in that it's horizontal instead of vertical. Now we've got pie charts. Pie charts show percentages of a whole, that whole being 100%. So your percentages in a pie chart must add up to 100%. You can't take 87% of one thing, 67% of another, and 33% of another and have that in a pie chart. Those numbers do not add up to 100%. And sometimes I've seen in past infographics, this trips students up. They think they can just show whatever percentage in a pie chart and it won't work because that percentage does not add up to 100%. This is my favorite pie chart. It is pie I have eaten, represented by the pie that is gone, versus pie I have not eaten. I like this visually as an example because we know that a pie here, an actual pie, is 100%. But here's an example from an infographic that a student did last spring. What she did was she sought out data from activeminds.org to show how students were being affected by the mental health crisis. It's a little bit hard to see, but in these pie charts, it's two separate charts. We have 80% of students reporting being negatively impacted by COVID-19. And what is represented here, 20%, right? This 20% of students report that they're not negatively affected. Here we have 85% of students reporting that their main challenge was staying focused on schoolwork. So here we have 85% with a challenge of focusing on schoolwork, and 15% who reported that they were not challenged. Their challenge was not staying focused on schoolwork. She has several other statistics here, reporting stress and anxiety, 91%, 81% reporting disappointment or sadness, and 80% reporting loneliness or isolation. Now you might ask yourself, why wouldn't she put these in a chart? Well, there's no real easy way to represent these in a chart because they are three different things. You could do them in a bar chart, but you would, if this were the bar chart, along the left side, you would have each one of these things: report stress or anxiety, report disappointment or sadness, report loneliness or isolation. And along the bottom, you would have the actual percentages. Although I don't know that with these particular statistics, making a bar chart is necessarily useful. For one thing, these percentages are all pretty close to each other. Here again is just a larger pullout of her national statistics. Her pie chart showing that 80% of students are negatively impacted, while 20% are not, and 85% of students are having trouble focusing on their schoolwork, while 15% do not. What are some other visual ways to show data? A chart is not your only option for making data visual in your infographic. You could use icons to show comparison, for example, or you could use a timeline. Here's an example of using icons and color and number to represent quantities. In this infographic, which is about period poverty, in other words, how the costs of menstruation and availability of menstrual products affects women. She is showing that 4% or 4 in 5 students have missed a class or know someone who has missed a class because of lack of access to period products. She's representing these with icons. We have 4 red icons to represent the 4 students out of 5, or the 84% here. And we have a gray icon to represent the 1 student out of 5 who is not affected. So how could you have represented this in a pie chart? Let's consider that for a second. Well, if your pie is 100%, then 84% slice of that pie, right, represents the students who have missed a class or know someone who has missed a class because of a lack of access to period products. And then a slice of 16% represents students who have not missed a class or who do not know someone who has missed a class. So while this was presented in icons, this could have also been done in a pie chart. Which is more effective? Well, given that these are female icons and it's representing just 4 out of 5, this is probably has more visual impact related to the topic than a pie chart. So the question arises, which is the most appropriate chart to use to represent? And in this case, I think icons is a more visually effective way of representing that data. And here we have a timeline. In this case, the timeline is describing, it's the timeline of the closing process at KU from the spring. This infographic hits every mark that we're looking for as you work on your own infographics. This one was created, by the way, in InDesign. There wouldn't be a way to go to Canva and create this infographic. So I'm going to go to the ways all of these things connect to the infographic. But first, I just want to talk about the timeline. This student has drawn in InDesign this thermometer. And she has put a gradient color in the thermometer. Yellow meaning warm, and then getting hotter, and then getting super hot, and then cooling off. So the color visually represents, even without looking at the timeline, the color visually represents what was going on at the University of Kansas at that time. She could have done this with just one color, but think about how much more effective this is because she used the color gradient. It's emotional to be able to see this color going from yellow to red and then back to green. So she drew this thermometer, and then she connected with each line you see on the thermometer the different things that were happening in the timeline. So we start with March 5th, right? This goes with March 5th, March 11th, March 12th, March 14th, March 17th, March 30th, April 2nd, and May 1st. What's great about this infographic is it doesn't overload the infographic with words and information. A great infographic is about the visuals and the words and how they go together, but it's not about writing a bunch of words and then just having some sort of icon or illustration to go with them. You can do it that way, but this is really ideal where there's a very strong visual connection between the timeline and the graphic. As you know, as we've been saying more than once, your infographic must have at least three original photographs or graphic images. In this case, this graphic has 4. She's used 3 photographs, and these photographs were photos that Courtney had taken at some point before the school shut down, the lockdown, or the distance learning. And so she's connected them with, the library's closed. Here's a picture of the library. Sports canceled. Here's a picture of basketball. And a 5-phase plan to reopen the campus by fall. And here's a picture of campus. So this is an absolutely spot-on infographic because it's doing everything that the infographic assignment that we're giving you requires. What's more, her sources are the University Daily Kansan. So you don't need a lot of sources for this. Remember, you want your infographic to be focused. And this is a very clear focus. You've just got a limited space and you can't do too much. And there's a tendency sometimes with students to overplan what they're going to do in their infographic. And in this case, the focus really helps. Also, having a focus will help you be able to concentrate your efforts and create something much stronger than if you try to do too many things. So we have a very good example here of what you might do. Now, let's talk about, just as an experiment or a little test, which infographic you would use. You have data for the changes in the wildlife population of dolphin, bears, and whales for the last 5 years. Take a second to consider. What kind of chart would you use? Data that is showing changes in the last 5 years, so changes over time. If you're thinking timeline, if you're thinking line chart, you would be correct. Here's an infographic of the changes in that wildlife population. Now, this wouldn't work. This topic wouldn't work for KU, for your infographic, because it doesn't have that local focus. Remember, we want you to do something that is newsworthy and has a local focus. Now, if this was an infographic focused on the changes in time over the squirrel population at KU, that would be more relevant, but that data is most likely not available. So what we see here are the changes over time in the wildlife population between 2017 and 2022. We've got bears in blue, dolphins in red or orange, and whales in gray. And what this particular, because this is not actually a real infographic, this is one that somebody just put together. What's missing? What is missing from this timeline? What is missing from this line chart? What information is missing? Well, the information is missing is we don't know what these numbers represent. Is this 200,000? Is this 200? So one of the things you would have to be clear about in your key is what the numbers along the side represent. What is the quantity represented? Also, we don't know where this is. Is this the United States? Is this the world population? Again, as I said, this is not an ideal line chart, but it's good for our purposes because you can see how the creator used color to show the changes over time. But we absolutely would have to know what these quantities represent and also what kind of area we're talking about. Which would you use? You have data comparing how much time students spend on their phones each day. Okay? In social networking, being creative, and being productive. So you have data on 3 things: social networking, being creative, and being productive. And its time is the quantity. Right? So you've got 2 things here. You've got things and you've got time. The things you're comparing and time. Here's what a student did in the class last spring with that information. Phone usage during quarantine. And by the way, Drake Simmons, who created this infographic, did do this in InDesign. And it's very clever because the graphic itself represents a phone. He has created in InDesign these little icons. He would have taken these icons from the internet. In the spring, our requirements had to change. So these are not original graphics, of course. And however, he did create this original bar chart. The average time spent in apps, 6 hours and 48 minutes per day. The top 3 most used apps. But here's the bar chart comparing the average time students spent. Social networking in blue, creativity in light blue, and productivity in orange. So we've got these three things along the bottom, 1, 2, 3. And along the side, we go from 0 to 10 hours a day. So 5 hours a day is the middle, and then he's got a line for the average amount of time. So it looks like it's something around 7 hours. Nobody is reaching that average. Social networking, 3 hours and 24 minutes. So you see, if you came across from this bar over to here, you would see that that bar hits at 3 hours and 24 minutes. Creativity, 2 hours and 13 minutes. And then productivity, 1 hour and 11 minutes. So these bar heights correspond to this amount of time. Now, you might ask yourself, why not just put the numbers, the hours? Why bother with the chart? But look at that chart for a second. See how visual that is? We see social networking, and we immediately know from looking at it without even reading the numbers that students are spending more time in social networking during quarantine than they were spending doing creative projects or productive projects. So the chart itself triggers a reaction in the viewer, an automatic kind of processing or inference from the chart itself. Now, the layout of this, he had to manage the layout of this. In a perfect world, these three would not be along the bottom, detached from the chart. However, because of the use of color, we do make that connection with creativity, productivity, and social networking. Which would you use? Out of 130 respondents, 72% reported either knowing someone who was sexually assaulted during their college experience or experienced it themselves. 130 respondents is 100% of the respondents. Of 100% of the respondents, 72% reported either knowing someone, while 28% reported or said that they did not know someone who'd been sexually assaulted. If you're thinking pie chart, you would be thinking correctly. This is an example from an infographic that Emma House made last spring, in which she was she was illustrating degrees of absence of consent. And with her summary, she says, in the age of the Me Too movement, college campus sexual assault cases have become more prevalent. More people are reporting their experiences. This is an inside look at that reality. So here is her pie chart. 72% say yes, 28% say no. She could have just had this copy here, but this copy is not as easy or as impactful to process as looking at this 72% gray area that says yes. So, your goal with charts is to pick the right one for your data to start with. How do you pick the right one? Find some data. Do your research on your infographic, see what numbers you come up with, and then go back and review the different kinds of charts and see how that data fits one of these charts. For many students, the easiest one to do is a pie chart. Unfortunately, a pie chart is not so easy to make in InDesign. You can make the circle, but making the slice of pie is more difficult. You can make them in Excel. And if you're going to use Canva, Canva does have a very easy way of creating both charts, bar charts, and also pie charts. If you want to try to do this in InDesign, I recommend that you contact Heather Lawrence at jschooltech.org, and she can help you figure out how to create that chart. But keep them simple. You're just starting. Most of you are just crawling. You're not running yet with infographics. So don't try to put too much information in your chart. The key is to make them easy to understand. And the beauty of a chart is that it helps the reader visually process information in a way that only words cannot.